Forget what you think you know about ancient civilizations. For most people, Egypt begins and ends with the pyramids, gold masks, and Hollywood mummies wrapped in mystery. But the real story, the one hidden behind the stone walls and whispered across desert winds, is much stranger, far more human, and infinitely more fascinating than any blockbuster version could offer. This isn't a tale about kings and gods alone. It's about how real people lived, loved, feared, ruled, and rebelled for more than 3,000 years in one of the longest-running civilizations in history. It's about their beliefs, their rituals, their secrets, many of which have only recently come to light through decoded texts and buried evidence. Not everything was carved in granite. Much of it was whispered, passed along, hidden in plain sight, or deliberately erased. And to truly understand it, we need to peel away the myths. Let's begin with a question. What did the ancient Egyptians believe about how the universe came to be? It didn't start with a bang. It didn't even start with the gods we usually hear about. The ancient Egyptians believed that in the beginning there was nothing but a vast, dark, watery chaos called none. No sky, no earth, no light. Then, from this formless nothingness, something stirred, a self-created force called Atom. Alone, infinite, and formless, Atom willed himself into existence. Not born, not made, just there. From his own essence, Atom created two other forces, Shu, the god of air, and Tefnut, the goddess of moisture. These were the building blocks, air and water, that would later give rise to everything. But even this divine beginning wasn't peaceful. Myths say Atom brought forth Shu and Tefnut through an act that modern ears might find jarring. Some say it was through spitting, others through an act of self-pleasure. In either case, creation wasn't majestic. It was raw, messy, intimate. And from this divine couple came Geb, the god of earth, and Nut, the goddess of the sky. The two were so deeply in love they clung to one another endlessly, locked in an eternal embrace. But Ra, one of the rising gods of the time, wasn't pleased. He ordered Shu to pry them apart, forever separating earth from sky, and giving birth to the world we now live in, a space for life to unfold between heaven and ground. These aren't just stories. They were the foundation of how the Egyptians saw life, death, order, and chaos. Every flood of the Nile, every planting season, every death and every birth echoed this cosmic drama. And it didn't stop there. From the union of Geb and Nut came the next generation of gods, Isis, Osiris, Seth, and Nephthys, each embodying forces of love, jealousy, death, and magic that shaped every aspect of Egyptian life. But this worldview didn't just stay in temples and papyri. It seeped into politics, sex, crime, and family. The gods were not distant, benevolent beings. They were flawed, passionate, and often ruthless, just like the rulers who claimed descent from them. Let's take the pharaohs, for example. These weren't just kings. To the Egyptian people, they were walking gods, living bridges between the heavens and the earth. Every royal act carried cosmic weight. If a pharaoh failed in his duties, the Nile might stop flowing. Crops could wither, plagues could fall upon the people. His body was divine, his words were sacred, and his blood had to remain pure. That's why the royal family often married within itself, brother to sister, father to daughter. This wasn't out of ignorance, but purpose. They believed divine blood must not be diluted by mortal influence. But the results were often tragic. Mental and physical defects plagued the ruling line. Yet even when things went wrong, it was seen not as a mistake, but as the price of sacred continuity. But not everything divine was pure. Some practices in the name of tradition, of religion, of royal preservation, were disturbing, even brutal. Let's talk about succession. Egypt didn't have a neat system for who would rule next. When a pharaoh died, it could lead to power struggles among sons, wives, concubines, generals, and priests. Bloodlines were contested. Alliances forged through seduction, treachery, and, sometimes, murder. It wasn't unusual for a new king to erase his predecessor's name from monuments. Not metaphorically. Literally chisel it out, destroy statues, even desecrate tombs. To the ancient Egyptians, removing a person's name was worse than death. It meant erasing their soul from the afterlife. This wasn't history. It was vengeance, etched in stone. And then there were the public rituals. Take the festival of Opet, for example, one of the grandest celebrations in Thebes. During this festival, statues of Ammonius, Mut, and Khonsu were carried in sacred boats through the streets, accompanied by music, feasting, and crowds that stretched for miles. But while the public celebrated, deeper mysteries were playing out behind closed temple doors. There, the pharaoh performed secret rites with the god's statues, rituals so sacred they were never written down. Some believe these rites symbolized divine conception, reenacting the myth of creation to renew the land's fertility. This connection between sex, creation, and divinity was not shameful in Egypt. It was sacred. The body was a temple, not a source of sin. Fertility gods like Min were openly worshipped with statues depicting erect phalluses. During his festivals, women danced in the streets, sang songs filled with innuendo, and offered fruit and flowers to promote harvests and childbirth. Foreign visitors were often horrified. But to the Egyptians, this was life, celebrated, not hidden. Yet not all desires were divine. There were also stories of obsession, revenge, and taboo, of queens who wielded sexuality as power, of priests who broke their celibacy vows in shadowed corridors, of nobles who collected lovers like trophies and peasants punished for overstepping invisible moral lines. And in the shadows of these stories, some real, some embroidered through centuries of retelling, one thing remains constant. Egypt was never the land of lifeless tombs and static statues. It was alive, messy, complicated, beautiful, brutal, and we're only beginning to scratch the surface. If ancient Egypt was a kingdom of gods, then its palaces were their battlegrounds. Behind the whitewashed walls and lotus-carved columns, the true games of power unfolded, not with armies and swords, but with silk, secrets, and softly spoken threats. At the heart of this world stood the pharaoh, not only as a ruler, but as a symbol. Every gesture he made, every person he touched, and every word he uttered carried religious weight. But no one ruled alone. Power was a hungry thing, and there were always others ready to feed it. Royal wives, concubines, priests, scribes, spies, and the ever-watching guards carved into the walls around them. Royal marriages weren't always about love. In fact, they rarely were. A pharaoh might have one great wife, the queen officially recognized by temple and court, but dozens of secondary wives and concubines often lived in the palace complex. These women came from noble Egyptian families, conquered lands, or were offered as tokens of allegiance by foreign rulers. Some were little more than diplomatic hostages with a smile. Yet within this gilded cage, politics thrived. Women in the royal harem were not powerless. Many were educated, multilingual, and cunning. Some even received instruction in administration, mathematics, and religion, especially if their sons had a chance at the throne. A royal mother could raise a god. But competition was fierce. If your child ascended, you rose with him. If he failed, you might vanish, erased from records, exiled, or worse. Behind every young prince was a woman with everything to lose and everything to gain. And sometimes the stakes led to blood. There are ancient scrolls that tell stories not just of love and worship, but of plots and betrayals. A fragment known as the Harem Conspiracy Papyrus reveals one of the most infamous court dramas in Egyptian history. In it, Queen Tai, one of Ramesses III's lesser wives, allegedly conspired with palace officials, magicians, and servants to assassinate the aging king. Why? To place her own son on the throne. They used poisons, spells, secret messages wrapped in cloth and tucked into sandals. The conspiracy nearly succeeded. Ramesses III was likely killed, though his son still lost the battle for the crown. The conspirators were hunted, tried, and sentenced. Some were executed, others mutilated, ears cut off, tongues torn out. One was forced to take his own life with a blade, right there in court. But even in disgrace, these conspirators live on, immortalized by the records meant to bury them. Royal power wasn't just a burden, it was a danger. Even as a king, your enemies might be your own blood. Siblings, half-brothers, ambitious generals raised in your household. Pharaohs were crowned as living gods, but died like men, sometimes at the hands of those who kissed their rings. So, control was everything. Control over people, over appearances, over stories. This is why the Egyptians became masters of image and illusion. Every statue, every wall carving, every ceremonial act was carefully planned, not just for beauty, but to send a message. The king is strong. The gods are pleased. Order is unshaken. But that was often far from the truth. Reality inside the temples could be brutal. Punishments for disobedience weren't symbolic. They were physical. A scribe caught leaking royal information might have his hands severed. A priest who violated temple purity could be burned alive or buried under stone. And there were stories of women in the harem who stepped out of line, whether through jealousy, disobedience, or seduction, being quietly disappeared. No inscription, no burial, no name. This was the dark underside of the divine order, the price of control. Still, for all the cruelty, there were strange freedoms in ancient Egypt, especially for women. Unlike many other ancient cultures, Egyptian women could own property, run businesses, and even sue men in court. They could become priestesses, doctors, musicians, and high officials. There were recorded cases of women leading entire medical schools and managing vast estates. Even marriage contracts gave women certain protections. A wife could demand compensation if her husband took a second wife. She could initiate divorce and leave with her property. Some women even inherited family land, bypassing male relatives entirely. But these freedoms came with silent rules. A woman's reputation mattered more than her wealth. Her appearance, modesty, and loyalty were constantly under watch. And for royal women, every move was political. If a queen became too popular, too clever, or too beloved by the people, she could be seen as a threat. The line between divine femininity and dangerous influence was razor thin. Some queens learned to walk that line with precision. Others overstepped and were erased. Take Queen Hatshepsut, for example. She ruled as a pharaoh in her own right, donning the false beard and traditional garb of kings. She oversaw massive building projects, trade expansions, and years of peace. But after her death, someone, likely her stepson Thutmose III, attempted to obliterate her legacy. Statues smashed, cartouches chiseled off. Her name vanished from the official king list. Yet she endures, found again by archaeologists who read the layers of silence like a second language. That's the truth of Egypt. What was meant to be buried often finds a way back to the surface. And it's not just rulers whose stories rise again. Everyday people, too, left behind fragments of their lives, notes scrawled on pottery, prayers scratched into walls, recipes, jokes, dreams. These are the pieces that remind us Egypt wasn't just a kingdom of gods. It was a nation of human beings, full of ambition, anxiety, jealousy, laughter, and hope. They weren't so different from us. They longed for security, for love, for legacy. And many of them, perhaps unknowingly, found immortality, not in gold, but in the words and traces they left behind. The streets of ancient Egypt were a world away from the palaces and temples. Out here, life was both simpler and more unpredictable. A fisherman on the Nile feared not just crocodiles but curses. A baker's wife might whisper a prayer into rising dough. A scribe could spend his entire life recording grain inventory by day and pleading with gods in private by night, terrified of what would await him after death if he made a mistake. For all its grandeur, Egypt was a society obsessed with order because chaos was always close. They even had a word for it, Isfit, a cosmic force of disorder that had to be held at bay. Every part of society, from how you tilled your field to how you buried your dead, was designed to maintain Ma'at, the divine balance of truth, harmony, and justice. This obsession with cosmic order was not abstract. It was personal. It bled into every daily routine. Children were taught from an early age that their actions echoed in the universe. To lie, cheat, or mistreat someone wasn't just immoral. It was dangerous. It could upset the balance, invite disease, misfortune, or even death. A person who broke Ma'at wasn't just punished in this life. They were hunted in the next. And the afterlife? It wasn't a resting place. It was a trial. The ancient Egyptians didn't believe you simply died and went to heaven or hell. Instead, your soul was judged. In the famous weighing of the heart ceremony, the heart of the deceased was placed on one side of a scale, and a feather, representing Ma'at, was placed on the other. If your heart was heavier with sin than the feather, your soul was devoured by a creature called Amit, part lion, part crocodile, part hippo. Total obliteration. No second chances. No afterlife. This fear of erasure was worse than death. And so, the Egyptians did everything they could to prepare. They filled tombs with spells, tools, food, and tiny statues called shabtis, which were believed to work for the dead in the afterlife. They commissioned funerary texts like the Book of the Dead, a kind of spiritual survival manual filled with passwords, rituals, and magical instructions to navigate the perils of the underworld. But not everyone could afford elaborate tombs or magical scrolls. For the poor, protection came in smaller, more intimate forms: amulets, chants, protective tattoos. Some wore eye-shaped charms to ward off evil glances. Others kept small figurines of gods hidden in their homes or buried under doorways. Even love spells, written on bits of papyrus or pottery, were used not just to win affection, but to guard against rivals. Fear was everywhere, and where fear exists, so does power. That's where magic, or Heka, came in, not as fantasy, but as a central part of daily life. To the Egyptians, Heka wasn't superstition. It was a force just as real as gravity or fire. The gods used it. So did kings. So did farmers, mothers, midwives, and soldiers. A priest might perform a ritual to protect the land from famine. A healer could recite an incantation over a wound. A mother could spit 3 times to ward off a demon she believed was lurking near her newborn's crib. And yet, this same magic could be twisted. Just as there were healers and protectors, there were also those who used spells to harm, to curse, to seduce, to kill. Magical warfare was real. A rival could write your name on a piece of clay, stab it with a knife, and burn it in a fire. This wasn't symbolic. It was an attack. The logic was simple. Damage the name, damage the soul. And the name mattered, more than we can easily understand today. Your name was your essence. It was tied to your spirit. Erasing someone's name from history, chiseling it off walls or scratching it out of scrolls, was a form of spiritual murder. It meant your soul couldn't be remembered, couldn't be honored, and would wither in the afterlife. This is why even the dead were protected with written prayers and curses. A tomb wall might threaten intruders with divine retribution. Any who enters here shall lose their eyes, their offspring, and their place among the living and the dead. It wasn't just about gold. It was about legacy. Still, for all their fears of death and disorder, Egyptians loved life. Their art wasn't just about gods and pharaohs. It showed children playing, workers joking, dancers moving with joy, lovers embracing under stars. Music and wine flowed during festivals. Families gathered under date palms. Farmers sang to oxen in the fields. They believed in beauty, in rhythm, in moments, and they wrote about it in poetry so intimate, it still stirs the heart today. One ancient love poem reads, "My heart flutters hastily when I think of my love for you. It lets me not act sensibly. It leaps from its place. It lets me not put on a dress, nor wrap my scarf around me." These weren't dry philosophers or distant rulers. They were people, vividly human. But even in love, the divine was never far. Marriage and sex weren't private matters. They were sacred acts, woven into myth and magic. A union between 2 people was a recreation of divine order, mirroring the union of gods like Isis and Osiris. And childbirth was more than biology. It was a miracle that required protection from evil forces that might snatch the baby's soul before its first breath. That's why midwives invoked Taurit, the hippo-headed goddess of protection, and Bes, the dwarf god of childbirth and laughter, during deliveries. These odd-looking deities weren't comic. They were fierce guardians, protectors of the vulnerable. Even in their strangeness, they were sacred. And so the Egyptian world turned, on ritual and risk, beauty and fear, love and magic. A civilization clinging to balance, not because it was easy, but because the alternative was unthinkable. We often look at the ruins of ancient Egypt as silent wonders, pyramids under a baking sun, statues worn smooth by sand and time. But to the people who built them, these were not lifeless structures. They were living, breathing messages, meant to speak across centuries. Every brick had a reason. Every carving carried a meaning. And every shadow cast on those massive stones was part of a language we're still learning to decode. Take the pyramids. Tourists gaze up at them and think, tombs. But in truth, they were far more than places to bury kings. The pyramid was a symbol, a sacred geometric expression of the primeval mound that rose out of chaos in the ancient creation myth. Just as the god Atom emerged from the waters of nothingness, so too did the pyramid rise from the desert floor, pointing upward, forever connecting the earth to the heavens. To the Egyptians, a pyramid wasn't just a resting place. It was a resurrection machine. Inside, Complex corridors were aligned with astronomical precision. Shafts pointed toward specific stars believed to house the spirits of departed kings. The very structure was designed to help the soul of the pharaoh ascend to join the gods among the stars. And then there were the obelisks, those towering needles of granite found across Egypt. We see them in city squares and museums, far from their original homes. But back then, they were markers of divine presence. Each one was carved from a single stone and placed near temple entrances, believed to house a spark of the sun god Ra. When sunlight hit their tips, often capped with gold or electrum, it wasn't just a dazzling spectacle. It was a sacred moment, God touching earth. These weren't random shapes. They were ancient prayers cast in stone. But it wasn't just about the gods. It was also about power. Building on such a massive scale required more than vision. It required labor, planning, and control. The image of slaves toiling under whips is misleading. Most laborers were skilled workers, stonemasons, engineers, artisans, who lived in purpose-built villages, received rations, and even had medical care. They worked in teams with names like the Drunkards of Menkor, and left behind graffiti mocking supervisors and celebrating completed work. Still, the work was brutal. Death and injury were common. Bones found near pyramid sites show evidence of crushed limbs, worn joints, broken backs. And yet, they kept building, not just for the rulers, but for eternity. Temples were another world entirely. Step into the ruins of Karnak or Luxor today, and you can still feel it. The hush, the weight of stone, the deliberate alignment of columns with a rising sun. These weren't places for worship in the modern sense. Ordinary people weren't allowed in the inner sanctuaries. The temples were cosmic machines, reenacting the daily birth of the universe through ritual. At dawn, priests would wash, dress, and feed the god's statue as if it were a living being. They would light incense, speak sacred words, and close the doors again until the next sunrise. The statue itself was often hidden deep within the temple, seen only by high priests and pharaohs. But everyone believed it was watching, alive with divine presence. And these rituals weren't just ceremony. They were protection. By repeating them, the priests ensured the sun would rise, the Nile would flood, and life would go on. To fail in ritual was to risk cosmic collapse. That's how seriously they took order. Even language was sacred. Hieroglyphs weren't just writing. They were pictures of life itself. The act of carving them into stone was a form of magic. Once a name or event was inscribed, it was believed to exist forever. That's why names were so carefully preserved, or deliberately destroyed. To write something down was to make it real, and to remove it was to erase it from existence. This was the terrible beauty of Egyptian memory. It could be eternal, or it could vanish completely. Take Akhenaten, the so-called heretic pharaoh. He dared to change everything, abandoning the old gods in favor of a single deity, the Aten, the sun disk. He moved the capital to a new city, Amarna, and demanded that only Aten be worshipped. Statues of old gods were smashed, temples left to crumble. But after his death, his revolution crumbled too. The priests of Ammonius returned to power. The old ways were restored. Akhenaten's name was chiseled off walls, his city abandoned, his monuments buried in sand. He became a ghost, a king who tried to silence the gods, and was in turn silenced by history. And yet, we found him again. We always do, because history doesn't stay buried forever. The sands shift, tombs crack open, and truth seeps back into light. One of the most mysterious examples of this is the Valley of the Kings. Cut deep into the cliffs of Luxor, This place holds the tombs of Egypt's greatest rulers. Unlike the Grand Pyramids, these tombs were hidden, designed to guard their treasures from thieves and protect the pharaoh's journey through the afterlife. Painted walls showed vivid scenes of the soul's voyage: boats sailing through fire, serpents swallowing stars, gods with jackal heads and human hearts. These were not meant for our eyes. They were instructions for eternity. And yet, when archaeologists peeled away the rocks and dust, they found not just bones and gold, but fingerprints, graffiti, notes. One message, left by a worker thousands of years ago, simply reads, "I am here. I saw." That, perhaps, is what Egypt offers us most: a sense that across all time and distance, someone lived, someone built, someone hoped to be remembered. And so they carved their names into stone and shaped the world around them, not just for the present, but for forever. In ancient Egypt, death was not an end. It was a threshold, a crossing over into another form of existence. And how that transition unfolded depended entirely on how you were remembered, how you were buried, and whether your soul was guided correctly through the layers of the next world. For all their monuments and gods, Egyptians were deeply emotional people. Grief was not hidden. It was expressed loudly, publicly, and often ritually. At funerals, women wept with open arms, tearing their clothes and covering their heads with dust. Professional mourners were sometimes hired, not because the family lacked feeling, but because expressing sorrow was considered a sacred responsibility. Death had to be acknowledged. Grief had to be shown. To bottle it up was to disrespect the soul of the departed, and risk disturbing their passage to the afterlife. And what a journey that was! The path through death was never simple. In the Egyptian imagination, it was a sprawling, perilous voyage across a dark and sacred landscape. The underworld, known as the Duat, was filled with demons, rivers of fire, magic gates, talking animals, and gods who could judge with a glance. The journey took 12 hours, one for each hour of the night, and required knowledge, courage, and favor from the divine. No one was guaranteed safe passage, not even a king. This is why tombs mattered so much. From the tiniest burial pit to the grandest royal chamber, tombs were built as launch pads into eternity. They were not made for visitors. They were carefully sealed, filled with protective charms, food offerings, household items, weapons, and sacred texts. Everything a soul might need to survive the darkness and reach the field of reeds, the Egyptian version of paradise. But it wasn't just about possessions. The heart of every burial was the preservation of the body. To be preserved meant to be whole, and to be whole was to be recognized by the gods. So the body was carefully washed, packed, wrapped, scented, and sealed over weeks. Organs were removed and placed in specially carved jars, each guarded by a protective deity. The brain, seen as unnecessary, was discarded. But the heart, that was sacred. It held memory, morality, and identity. It had to remain untouched, for it would be weighed in the hall of judgment. Even the face of the deceased was considered important. That's why so many mummies were buried with masks, not just to cover the face, but to present an ideal version of the soul. Gold for royalty, painted wood or cartonnage for others. The mask was a bridge between earthly self and divine essence. Still, not everyone could afford embalming or ornate tombs. For the poor, burial was simpler but no less meaningful. Graves were shallow, lined with stones or pots, and marked with whatever could be spared. Sometimes, family members carved simple prayers or left small offerings, bread, beer, or a flower. And even the smallest grave was touched by ritual, because death was never taken lightly. The fear was not of dying, but of being forgotten. That was the true end. If no one spoke your name, if no offering was made on your behalf, your soul might wander, lost. This is why remembrance mattered so deeply. Families visited tombs on feast days, poured water for the dead, and spoke their names aloud. To say a name was to keep it alive. This connection between the living and the dead was constant, cyclical, and sometimes the dead spoke back. Letters to the dead were a real practice. A wife might write to her deceased husband, asking him to protect their child or to punish someone who wronged her. A son might plead for forgiveness or dream of advice whispered in the dark. These letters were left at tombs, scratched onto pottery, or buried in offering jars, hoping, perhaps, that the veil between worlds was thin enough for love to cross it. That's what Egypt teaches us, that memory, ritual, and love do not end with breath. They endure. And yet, even this deeply spiritual system had its fears and failures. Tomb robbing was a constant threat. Despite their best efforts, many ancient tombs were looted just years after burial. Gold was stolen, mummies unwrapped, sacred items melted down or sold. Even kings were not spared. Some priests, desperate to protect their dead, began reburying royal mummies in secret caches, hidden deep in cliffs. That's how we discovered the mummies of Seti I, Ramesses II, and many others, removed from their golden tombs and buried together in silence, saved not by their monuments, but by the hands of caretakers who defied time. Today, we walk through museums and see these remains under glass, faces cracked, limbs folded. We whisper in awe. We take photographs. But do we understand? These were people who lived entire lives, who held their children, argued with neighbors, offered prayers at sunrise, and hoped, more than anything, that they would not be erased. Somewhere, between the faded ink of a scroll and the silence of a sealed coffin, there is a story still trying to be heard, and we are the ones listening now. If the temples and tombs were built to touch eternity, the homes of ancient Egyptians were made for the sun, the soil, and the passing of days. Here, behind mud brick walls and reed doors, life unfolded in simple, rhythmic cycles: plant, harvest, cook, sleep, pray, repeat. Most Egyptians were not kings or priests. They were farmers, craftsmen, fishermen, servants. And while the monuments told the story of the elite, it was the hands of these ordinary people that built a kingdom which endured for 3,000 years. A typical Egyptian home was modest. 1 or 2 rooms, flat-roofed, sometimes with stairs leading up to the roof where sleeping could be cooler under the stars. Families shared space, meals, tools, and silence. There were no glass windows, no locked cupboards. Privacy wasn't a concept. It was a luxury. But these homes were full of life. Children chased chickens through courtyards. Women kneaded dough on grinding stones, their arms dusted with flour. Men patched fishing nets or painted wooden statues to sell at the market. In the evenings, families gathered around small fires, eating bread dipped in oil, lentils, garlic, leeks, flavors that still echo in Egyptian kitchens today. And bread was everything. The entire Egyptian diet revolved around grain. Wheat and barley were not only food, they were currency. Workers were paid in loaves and beer. A man's wealth could be measured in sacks of grain, not coins. Bread ovens were sacred spaces, and beer, thick, sweet, sometimes cloudy, was drunk daily, not as a luxury, but as a staple. Yet for all the simplicity of food, cooking was an art passed from generation to generation. Recipes weren't written down. They were taught by hand and memory. Meat was rare, fish more common, honey was precious. Salt and natron were used not only to season food, but to preserve it, and to prepare bodies for the afterlife. The people worked hard. The Nile's floodplain was both gift and master. Each year, when the river rose and spilled over its banks, farmers rushed to sow the moist black soil before the heat returned. It was a race against time and nature. Irrigation canals were dug with bare hands. Shadufs, simple levered buckets, lifted water from river to field. And when the harvest came, taxes came with it. Yes, taxes. Pharaohs did not rule alone. Beneath them was a vast machinery of scribes and overseers, constantly measuring, recording, collecting. Everything was counted: grain, livestock, land, labor. Scribes were the quiet power behind the throne. With a brush and ink, they documented births, marriages, crimes, debts. To be a scribe was to rise above manual labor, to earn respect, and perhaps even a glimpse of the palace life. But that didn't mean life was easy. Injury, disease, and hunger were daily threats. Without modern medicine, families relied on herbal remedies and spells passed through generations. Papyrus scrolls have been found detailing treatments for toothaches, infections, broken bones, even birth control. Honey, crocodile dung, beer, and moldy bread all found their way into medicine. And through it all, the gods were never far. A cut might be treated with a poultice, yes, but also with a prayer to Sekhmet, goddess of plague and healing. A cough might lead to a sip of herbs and an offering of incense. A sleepless night might be eased with a charm tucked beneath the pillow. Religion wasn't a separate activity. It was infused into every part of life. A farmer ploughing his field might stop to thank Geb, the god of earth. A fisherman might whisper to Sobek, lord of crocodiles and the river. A new bride might offer flowers to Hathor, goddess of love and joy. Children were taught not only how to walk or write, but how to show reverence, how to speak to the divine. And perhaps nowhere was this blend of sacred and simple more clear than in the role of women. Despite the centuries between us, Egyptian women had rights many later civilizations would strip away. They could own property, run businesses, inherit land, and testify in court. They could write wills, divorce husbands, and raise children without male guardians. Some women even rose to be priestesses, doctors, or royal advisors. Marriage, too, was personal. While many unions were arranged, love was not absent. Ancient Egyptian love poetry survives, soft, delicate, and startlingly modern in tone. One reads, "I would rather be close to you than to my own heart. I would walk through fire to hear your voice. The wind carries your name into my dreams." Of course, not all was harmony. There were divorces, disputes, jealousy, and heartbreak. But these were not hushed away. They were acknowledged, handled, even documented, because life, for the Egyptians, was not divided into sacred and profane. It was a continuum. The body, the soul, the soil, they were all connected. One could cook with reverence. One could pray while sweeping the floor. One could love while fearing the gods. And in this quiet blend of survival and spirituality, Egypt found its rhythm. A rhythm that pulsed from palace to plough, from cradle to coffin. A rhythm that, thousands of years later, we can still feel, if we listen closely enough. To truly understand ancient Egypt, we must look beyond the stone and sand, to the invisible structures that held everything together. Beneath the rituals, beyond the tombs, deeper than the Nile's flood, There was something far more powerful guiding this civilization. Maat. Maat wasn't a building, or a god you could touch. She was an idea, perhaps the most important idea in all of ancient Egyptian life. She represented balance, justice, truth, and harmony. To live in alignment with Maat was to walk in peace. To defy her was to invite chaos, drought, death. Even the gods were bound by her laws. And the pharaoh? His sacred duty was to uphold Maat in every decision, from war to farming, from taxes to temple construction. You might think of her as gravity for the soul, an unseen force holding everything in place. Every Egyptian, no matter how poor or powerful, lived under Maat's gaze. This didn't mean they were perfect. There were crimes. There were lies. But there was also confession, correction, and an ever-present effort to restore balance. That's why courtrooms were sacred spaces. Judges didn't just weigh evidence. They invoked Maat herself. To lie in court was not only to deceive a human, but to insult the cosmos. Even the afterlife was a test of Maat. At death, your heart was placed on a scale. On the other side, a feather, the symbol of Maat. If your heart was lighter, you passed on to paradise. If heavier with sin, it was devoured by a demon called Ammit. You ceased to exist. No rebirth. No soul. Just silence. It's a chilling thought, but also one of rare fairness. In a world full of inequality, the final judgment was based not on your status, but on the weight of your deeds. And this belief in cosmic justice extended into daily life. Scribes were taught that honesty was more lasting than wealth. Farmers prayed not just for rain, but for the fairness of their overseers. Even kings recorded acts of mercy to show future generations that they ruled with balance. But Maat did not stand alone. She existed in tension with her twin force, Isfet. Where Maat was order, Isfet was chaos. Not just violence or war, but the small things too. Greed, laziness, cruelty, deception. Isfet was always lurking, waiting for cracks to open. And so every action, every ritual, every word was chosen carefully to keep the world from tipping into darkness. And yet, the Egyptians did not fear chaos. They understood it. They accepted it as part of the cycle. Just as the Nile flooded and receded, just as stars vanished and returned, so too did chaos come and go. The trick was not to eliminate it, but to manage it, to dance with it, to restore balance, again and again. This philosophy influenced everything, even architecture. Temples weren't just built for beauty. They were designed to channel cosmic energy. Each wall, each column, each statue was placed with intention to reflect the order of the universe. Many temples were aligned with specific stars or solstices, casting light through dark corridors only once per year, like a breath of divine approval. Walking through such a space wasn't just religious, it was existential. You weren't just visiting a temple, you were entering the blueprint of the universe. And this sense of order trickled into family life too. Fathers taught sons not only to plough and carve, but to speak kindly, to walk humbly, to act with balance. Mothers sang lullabies with words of Maat woven into them. Children learned to recite hymns of harmony long before they could write their own names. And yet, there was warmth. Egyptian households weren't cold or overly strict. Laughter rang out in village squares. Festivals lit the calendar with joy. People told stories, shared jokes, played music with flutes and drums made from reeds and clay. It was not a perfect world, But it was a world striving for equilibrium. Even animals had a place in this sacred dance. Cats were beloved not just for hunting mice, but for their grace and stillness. To kill one, even by accident, could bring harsh penalties. Dogs were companions. Ibis birds were honored. Crocodiles and hippos, though dangerous, were respected as vessels of divine power. Nature wasn't something to conquer. It was something to cooperate with. And so, whether planting barley, building a wall, raising a child, or burying a loved one, an Egyptian was always aware of the balance, always trying to keep the scale steady. In many ways, this is what made Egypt so enduring. Not the pyramids, not the gold, but the philosophy that life, in all its pain and beauty, is a balancing act, that each moment offers a choice, to tip toward harmony or chaos, and that somewhere, far beyond the stars, the feather of Maat still waits on her scale, watching. To walk the streets of ancient Egypt was to move through a world where magic pulsed beneath the surface of everything. It was not illusion, not fantasy, not a fringe idea. It was woven into daily life, spoken in quiet phrases, hidden inside trinkets, stirred into cups of wine. Magic, Heka, was not a superstition. It was a sacred force, given by the gods at the beginning of creation. It flowed through priests and healers, but also through farmers, mothers, and scribes. Anyone could use it. Anyone could shape reality, if they had the knowledge, the will, and the right words. Words, after all, were spells. To speak a name was to summon a thing into being. To write it down was to preserve it forever. Hieroglyphs, with their animal shapes and intricate lines, were not just letters. They were vessels. Every carved symbol carried energy. A falcon on a temple wall wasn't just decoration. It was Horus, present in spirit, watching. And so the Egyptians treated writing with reverence. A mistake in a sacred scroll wasn't crossed out. It was ritually corrected. A prayer written on papyrus was kept close, worn as a charm, or buried with the dead. There were spells for everything. Spells to ease childbirth. Spells to protect a boat on the river. Spells to keep scorpions away. Spells to make a lover return. The line between prayer and incantation was thin, sometimes indistinguishable. But the power came not only from divine favor. It came from knowing the right formula, at the right time, with the right heart. And alongside these words were objects, small, beautiful things that held enormous meaning. Amulets were everywhere, hung around necks, tied to wrists, tucked into bed linens, buried in tombs. The eye of Horus, the scarab beetle, the ankh, each had its own purpose. One for protection, one for rebirth, one for health. Children wore them to keep demons away. Soldiers wore them into battle. Even mummies were packed with dozens of tiny charms to guide the soul through the afterlife. But the most powerful magic of all? Names. To know something's true name was to control it. That's why the gods had many names, some secret, some shared only with priests. Pharaohs sometimes had 5 different titles, each reflecting a different cosmic role. Names were carefully chosen, chanted, and preserved. To erase a name was a terrible act. It was to destroy a soul's memory in the world of the living and cut off its journey in the next. This was the ultimate punishment, not physical death, but being forgotten. That's why enemies were sometimes struck from temple walls, their faces chipped away, their titles removed. It wasn't revenge. It was spiritual erasure. But not all magic was light. There was darker Heka, too. Whispers traded in alleys, curses baked into clay figures, inked warnings burned in fire. Someone wronged in love might bury a doll with binding cords around its limbs. Someone jealous might scribble a rival's name on pottery, then smash it beneath the moonlight. And yet, even dark magic followed rules. It was not chaotic, it was precise. To curse someone improperly was to risk it rebounding on yourself. That was the law of balance again, Ma'at guiding even the shadows. In temples, magic was elevated into ritual. Priests used incense, oils, hymns, and sacred water drawn before dawn. They chanted in the old language, words whose sounds carried force, whether or not the meaning was still remembered. They anointed statues, bathed relics, and spoke to gods not with faith alone, but with confidence, the belief that they were heard. Some priests were trained not only in religion, but in medicine, astrology, and dream interpretation. They read omens in bird calls, river patterns, and the flickering of flames. A sleepless night might be brought to the temple for translation. A strange birth might be recorded as a sign, because for the Egyptians, nothing happened without reason. Nothing was random. Everything had meaning, even if hidden. This magical thinking didn't separate them from the real world. It connected them to it. While we might call it superstition, to them it was common sense. If you could ask for protection, why wouldn't you? If the world was alive with spirit, why not listen? And this sensitivity shaped how they viewed disease, too. Illness wasn't just bacteria. It could be a curse, a breach of ritual, a misstep in behavior. That's why treatments often combined herbs with words, ointments with chants. A healer might offer figs and honey, but also speak a blessing as they wrapped the wound. The two approaches were not separate. They were one. This unity, of physical and spiritual, of body and symbol, made their world feel whole. It made dreams more real. It made prayers more immediate. It made fear more manageable. And in times of grief or danger, magic offered comfort, the belief that you were not alone. That help could come not just from neighbors, but from ancestors, from statues, from gods who heard your whisper in the dark. Even today, when we walk through museum halls and see these artifacts, tiny amulets, faded papyri, worn statues, we feel something. A tug, a trace of belief still lingering, because deep down, part of us still wishes the same things: to be protected, to be healed, to be heard, to be remembered. And in that way, we're not so different from those who lived by the Nile thousands of years ago, whispering spells into the wind and trusting that someone, somewhere, was listening. The temples of ancient Egypt rise from the earth like memories carved in stone. Towering pylons, columns like papyrus stalks, walls etched with scenes that shimmered in the firelight of priests. These were not just buildings. They were living beings, the skin and bone of the gods they honored. When an Egyptian approached a temple, they didn't come to admire its size. They came to step between worlds. A temple was designed to move you inward, from the noise of the outside world to the silent heart of divinity. Each layer was more sacred than the last. You might begin in the open courtyard, where the sun touched everything. Then you passed into shaded halls where thick stone muffled sound. Deeper still, darkness. And finally, the sanctuary, a tiny chamber housing the statue of a god, hidden from all but the most trusted priests. To reach that space was not just a physical act. It was a journey of purification. Before entering, one had to fast, to wash, to pray, to leave behind worldly concerns. You could not speak falsely. You could not carry anger. Only the clean in spirit were allowed near the presence of the divine. But few ever made it that far. For most people, The temple was a place to gather at the edges, to offer incense, to chant hymns, to light lamps and whisper requests into the stone. The gods would hear, even from afar. And what gods they were! Dozens of them. Hundreds, if you count the local variations. Gods with animal heads and human hearts. Gods who wept, who bled, who grew old, who fought for justice. They were not distant, abstract beings. They were deeply involved in human affairs. Ra sailed across the sky each day in his solar boat, battling the serpent of chaos every night so dawn could return. Osiris reigned over the afterlife, offering judgment and rebirth. Isis healed the sick and restored what was broken. Thoth recorded everything, every word, every life, every truth. These deities weren't just worshipped, they were interacted with. A statue wasn't just a symbol, it was a vessel. When properly anointed and spoken to, it was believed the god actually inhabited it. Priests would bathe the statue each morning, dress it, offer food, burn incense. Not as theatre, but as sacred duty. To neglect these tasks was to offend the divine, and risk tipping the world toward disorder. And the temples themselves? They were built as cosmic maps. Their walls told stories of creation, of divine battles, of royal victories. But more than that, they mirrored the heavens. Many were aligned with specific stars or solstices. At precise moments, light would strike hidden altars or illuminate the face of a god carved in relief. This was no accident. This was architecture as astrology. But temples weren't only for gods. They were centers of life. They housed schools, libraries, medical halls, and treasuries. Scribes trained there. Healers worked there. Taxes were stored there. Temples employed thousands. Gardeners, cooks, carpenters, musicians, dancers, guards. They were cities within cities. In fact, much of what we know about ancient Egypt comes from temple inscriptions. These weren't dusty prayers. They were records, detailed, vivid, and astonishingly precise. They recorded floods and famines, births and deaths, donations and wars. They told of rituals, festivals, and even everyday events. Some are etched so finely, you can still read them today, thousands of years later. But these sacred spaces weren't eternal. Time, conquest, and neglect eroded their power. Many were looted, others buried beneath sand. Some had their names scratched out by new kings, or their stones reused in later buildings. Yet even in ruin, they speak. Walk through Karnak, and you feel the hum of something old and watchful. Stand at Abu Simbel, and see how Ramses II aligned the temple so sunlight reaches the sanctuary only twice a year, on his birthday and coronation. Touch the walls of Dendra, and discover a ceiling painted with stars, constellations, and celestial boats. Every temple whispers. Every statue watches. And perhaps that's what Egypt knew best. That memory is not just held in books or minds. It can be carved, sung, aligned with stars, buried in sand and still rise again. Even in silence, they endure. Because Egypt did not separate the spiritual from the physical. They infused one into the other. A building was not just shelter, it was spell. A statue was not just stone, it was presence. A ritual was not performance, it was power. And as we gaze at these ruins now, we're not just tourists. We are witnesses. We are listeners. We are the final audience to an ancient performance still playing beneath the sun. If the temples and tombs were built to touch eternity, the homes of ancient Egyptians were made for the sun, the soil, and the passing of days. Here, behind mud-brick walls and reed doors, life unfolded in simple, rhythmic cycles: plant, harvest, cook, sleep, pray, repeat. Most Egyptians were not kings or priests. They were farmers, craftsmen, fishermen, servants, and while the monuments told the story of the elite, it was the hands of these ordinary people that built a kingdom which endured for 3,000 years. A typical Egyptian home was modest. 1 or 2 rooms, flat-roofed, sometimes with stairs leading up to the roof where sleeping could be cooler under the stars. Families shared space, meals, tools, and silence. There were no glass windows, no locked cupboards. Privacy wasn't a concept. It was a luxury. But these homes were full of life. Children chased chickens through courtyards. Women kneaded dough on grinding stones, their arms dusted with flour. Men patched fishing nets or painted wooden statues to sell at the market. In the evenings, families gathered around small fires, eating bread dipped in oil, lentils, garlic, leeks, flavors that still echo in Egyptian kitchens today. And bread was everything. The entire Egyptian diet revolved around grain. Wheat and barley were not only food, they were currency. Workers were paid in loaves and beer. A man's wealth could be measured in sacks of grain, not coins. Bread ovens were sacred spaces, and beer, thick, sweet, sometimes cloudy, was drunk daily, not as a luxury, but as a staple. Yet for all the simplicity of food, cooking was an art passed from generation to generation. Recipes weren't written down. They were taught by hand and memory. Meat was rare, fish more common, honey was precious. Salt and natron were used not only to season food, but to preserve it and to prepare bodies for the afterlife. The people worked hard. The Nile's floodplain was both gift and master. Each year, when the river rose and spilled over its banks, farmers rushed to sow the moist black soil before the heat returned. It was a race against time and nature. Irrigation canals were dug with bare hands. Shadufs, simple levered buckets, lifted water from river to field. And when the harvest came, taxes came with it. Yes, taxes. Pharaohs did not rule alone. Beneath them was a vast machinery of scribes and overseers, constantly measuring, recording, collecting. Everything was counted: grain, livestock, land, labor. Scribes were the quiet power behind the throne. With a brush and ink, they documented births, marriages, crimes, debts. To be a scribe was to rise above manual labor, to earn respect, and perhaps even a glimpse of the palace life. But that didn't mean life was easy. Injury, disease, and hunger were daily threats. Without modern medicine, families relied on herbal remedies and spells passed through generations. Papyrus scrolls have been found detailing treatments for toothaches, infections, broken bones, even birth control. Honey, crocodile dung, beer, and moldy bread all found their way into medicine. And through it all, the gods were never far. A cut might be treated with a poultice, yes, but also with a prayer to Sekhmet, goddess of plague and healing. A cough might lead to a sip of herbs and an offering of incense. A sleepless night might be eased with a charm tucked beneath the pillow. Religion wasn't a separate activity. It was infused into every part of life. A farmer ploughing his field might stop to thank Geb, the god of earth. A fisherman might whisper to Sobek, lord of crocodiles and the river. A new bride might offer flowers to Hathor, goddess of love and joy. Children were taught not only how to walk or write, but how to show reverence, how to speak to the divine. And perhaps nowhere was this blend of sacred and simple more clear than in the role of women. Despite the centuries between us, Egyptian women had rights many later civilizations would strip away. They could own property, run businesses, inherit land, and testify in court. They could write wills, divorce husbands, and raise children without male guardians. Some women even rose to be priestesses, doctors, or royal advisors. Marriage, too, was personal. While many unions were arranged, love was not absent. Ancient Egyptian love poetry survives, soft, delicate, and startlingly modern in tone. One reads, "I would rather be close to you than to my own heart. I would walk through fire to hear your voice. The wind carries your name into my dreams." Of course, not all was harmony. There were divorces, disputes, jealousy, and heartbreak. But these were not hushed away. They were acknowledged, handled, even documented, because life, for the Egyptians, was not divided into sacred and profane. It was a continuum. The body, the soul, the soil, they were all connected. One could cook with reverence. One could pray while sweeping the floor. One could love while fearing the gods. And in this quiet blend of survival and spirituality, Egypt found its rhythm. A rhythm that pulsed from palace to plough, from cradle to coffin. A rhythm that, thousands of years later, we can still feel, if we listen closely enough.